Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Part 4 of our 5-part series on the topic, The Future of the United States, Will Orwell's 1984 Be Realized? Our program today will have as a subtopic, Countdown to 1984, Is Big Brother Already Here? In order to deal with this very important subject, we are most pleased to welcome to our program Dr. Jerry Rosenberg. He is known as one of the country's leading futurists and is an expert on the relationship of technology to man. I'd also like to point out that previously he has taught at Cornell and Columbia universities. He has been a visiting professor at other institutions. He has written, received in 1962. Dr. Rosenberg, I assure you that on behalf of our staff, it's a very special privilege to have you on our program.
Thank you, Tony.
I would also like to welcome to question our distinguished guests, 3 members of the panel. First of all is Richard Snyder from the Department of Anthropology at North Idaho College, Lou Reed, a regular panelist, and Rich Cook, a pre-law student at North Idaho College. Richard Snyder is invited to commence the questioning.
Dr. Rosenberg, with all of the technology I hear about, it seems like a few months ago I read in a news magazine that there are satellites 22,500 miles up that can photograph a license plate on an automobile down here among us mortals. Are we in the United States, and perhaps the world, but specifically in the United States, are we somehow losing the privacy that has been kind of a tradition in the United States?
It's interesting you mentioned this satellite 22,500 miles up. Indeed, there are a number of satellites just at that point up in the air, and they're beaming information crisscrossing the United States. I don't know at the moment whether that kind of technology is impacting directly on our potential loss to privacy, but certainly there are other forms of technology that are causing great havoc and concern. The issue has been around, of course, ever since man has been around trying to find a little home to hide in, but it's become even more critical these days because we have the technology that can intrude. We have the technology primarily via the computer that can store 24 hours a day, doesn't get a headache, doesn't forget, easily retrieved, press of a button, and it's released. And so the benevolent, hungry machines and those people who control the machines are using this information, storing it, and very often misusing it. And so there are many, many potential threats to our privacy.
You mentioned computers, and of course, there's been quite a bit of information in the news recently about improvements, modernization by each person, for instance, having a number on a credit card,
Right.
and a number for this and a number for that, all of which are the same number. Are we really moving in that direction, or is that just a lot of hoopla over nothing?
Oh, surely. I mean, here we are sitting at North Idaho College, and to a lot of administrators and registrars, they don't even know what the student's name is. They just have a number. And very often the number is I don't know at this college, but very often numbers are Social Security numbers. That's become the standard national number. And of course, numbers are what can be easily absorbed and documented and kept on record for use to be retrieved along with other kinds of information. And we are moving into that we are moving in that direction, which is very testy because when you have that power, you have the power to collect information and knowledge about people, to, in many ways and forms, to control their destiny if you so wish to. And so the threat's very real. It's not that the issue of privacy is new. People have always been concerned about files kept on them. People have always been concerned how pieces of paper are used and pulled out, and perhaps they get blackmailed. But the issue really has come into focus because we are seeing an enormous amount of data that is accumulated that should not be accumulated on people, and at times when people are vulnerable, it is used against them, whether they want to get a credit rating, or they want to get a job, they want to get a mortgage. That's when this information can be pulled out and very often misused. And the real problem is that people don't get a chance to see what information is collected on them. It's hidden in the bowels of some data bank. And very often, when they're least able to protect themselves is when they are denied credit or any kind of service that they're looking for. And that's because, in part, their privacy has been invaded.
Lou Reed.
Well, you're answering the question today of, is Big Brother already here? Are you suggesting that the information is there, but it has to have perhaps the intention of the Big Brother in order to really misuse it? Have you, within your experience, been concerned that Big Brother actually was moving in?
Well, what's Big Brother? I mean, if we...
We're talking government.
Okay. The term Big Brother, of course, comes from that familiar popular book written by George Orwell, 1984, which primarily talks about a fantasy land that he hoped would never arrive. But indeed, there are Big Brothers around, and today when we talk about Big Brother, we refer to government, any form of government. And yes, our Big Brother is looking over our shoulder. They are not only collecting information, but the question is, where can you hide? And if they are watching your every movement, what do you do? How do you protect yourself? Do you rebel or do you submit? Of course, if we go back and reread 1984, we know what happens at the end of that book. He fights, and then poor little Winston Smith has no choice but to submit. And then he becomes so dependent on Big Brother, he doesn't make a move without asking permission. And if we move our society in that direction, it'll be a very sad day for us all.
But again, I'm asking if there was any period in your immediate history where you felt that the misuse of this information was more of a problem than at another time.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my own experience, let me cite an example, a personal example. I had attempted to open up a department store account at a store we call Abraham and Straus in New York City. And I just went over and filled out the form. About 2 weeks later, I get a letter from the store saying, credit denied. And I asked them why, and they said, well, we don't know why, but our credit bureau did not give you a favorable rating. So I said, well, I know there's a law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I'd like to know the address and name of the person to contact at the credit bureau to find out why they did not give me a good rating. And so I did that, and I got in touch with a company called TRW, which services retail operations in the New York metropolitan area. And they said, we'll send you a printout of what we have on you. And I got a printout which starts off by identifying from the year 1960 to 64 that I had and my wife together, we had opened up 2 department store credits. But since 1964, we were no longer worthy because we did not use those credits. This is in 1973. So I turned to my wife and said, don't we still have credit cards? And she pulled out her yard and yard of cards. And yes. And so I wrote a letter to TRW, say, please update. These are the following department stores and the following numbers. Obviously, you're giving me a poor rating because you're saying I'm a risk since I don't use credit. And about 3 weeks later, I got a reply from them, and it was an exact duplicate of the original printout. They did nothing. Now I got very angry. And so I pulled out formal stationery, and I wrote to them, and I said that I was involved in the Fair Credit Reporting Act in Washington, and I know my rights, and I wrote this book, and I mentioned some names. In other words, I was fighting power with power, if you will. And within 24 hours, I got a telegram from the president of TRW apologizing, and I got my credit card immediately. And, 3 cheers for me. But what about the poor guy in the street?
The one who hadn't written the book and the one who hadn't really pursued it or didn't know about the Act.
Most people, if they get turned down by one department store or one gas station, what do? They go to another department store or gas station. But funny thing, if they get turned down by one, they'll get turned down by all of them. And so ultimately they give up and they said, the heck with it. So where is the protection for the individual?
Well, it isn't there, obviously.
It isn't there.
Rich Cook.
Yes, Dr. Rosenberg, you're quoted in one of the local newspapers of last year of saying, "We think we have a right to privacy, but it is only a perceived right, not a real one. There is no right to privacy anyway in the, or anywhere in the Bill of Rights or Constitution." I was wondering if you could explain that statement for the viewers.
Okay, well, I know that you are a pre-law student, and I know gentleman sitting next to me is a teacher of constitutional law, and I'm not an attorney, but very carefully reading through the Constitution, Bill of Rights, the word privacy is never mentioned. Am I correct?
That's right.
So that one problem is that Americans, as wonderful as we all are very naive. We have assumed that we are guaranteed the right to privacy, but if it's not in the document of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, how can we be guaranteed it? It's implied. And since it's implied, it is to be defined from generation to generation. And based on the traumas of the moment, the crises of the moment, the pendulum swings. When we are at peace and everything goes well, it is usually not a great problem. But when we suddenly find the world caving in on us, then we begin to be threatened with the loss of privacy. If I could cite an example, during the early 1970s, under the Nixon administration, we were threatened with loss of privacy. Before that, under the Johnson administration, when Vietnam occurred, and before Vietnam, when cities were being burned down in Watts, California, in Newark, New Jersey, during the rioting and the Martin Luther King assassination and the Robert Kennedy assassination, we were very threatened with our loss of privacy, where congressional records show that the Pentagon and the White House approved federal agents, FBI agents, Pentagon agents, who would dress up in off the uniform and on went the regular civilian clothing, would infiltrate classrooms to watch teachers, to watch students, what were they saying. And the CIA was asked to do domestic spying during the early 1970s, and you're a little too young to know that period, but the CIA has never, in its history of existence, prior to that, done, as far as we know, domestic surveillance. It was international surveillance, but they did it in the early 70s. Right now we have a threat to our loss of privacy. Under the present administration, the President Reagan is very friendly and leans toward the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank that feeds the President and the administration a number of suggestions of where to take our country. And this foundation has been urging that we increase our domestic surveillance, and we do more wiretapping and more bugging, if you will. And so it fluctuates, and there are many threats involved in all that.
Dr. Rosenberg, I would like to give a little data and then get your reaction to it. The exclusionary rule that has been adopted by the court under their interpretation of the Constitution that does not allow evidence to be submitted to court if illegally obtained has been undergoing a change in our neighboring state, has been involved with this for the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm dealing with such issues as the clear sight doctrine of if you find illegal drugs or whatever it may be in the open, that you can take those without a search warrant, or the good faith doctrine. The policeman did not intend to make the mistake. And in a case from the Washington State University, recently the U.S. Supreme Court said that if an individual is arrested outside their home apartment, or their residence, that if they ask to go in to get a code or whatever it may be, that the policeman can go with them and they can obtain evidence that is not even involved in the arrest and use it without a search warrant. And I relate all this to electronic surveillance equipment that we have. Are we moving in a direction, and one of the themes of this convocation series and these TV programs has been that if the U.S. Supreme Court does not diligently watch those who have access to the electronic surveillance equipment, or the police and the courts and their use of search warrants, that we are in deep trouble, especially the poor, the less informed. Are we moving as a society through the court into less concern of how evidence is obtained that produces a trial for a defendant?
Well, look, one of the things that really must be introduced in this conversation as we talk about laws and Supreme Court warrants and legal rights of individuals is that the traditional interpretations are really no longer applicable. The technology is so sophisticated that we have ways through with lasers and other forms of technology to penetrate the privacy of individuals without having to go through the physical, getting into someone's private castle in his home. They can plant long distance through telephone wires. With beams, they can infiltrate and to hear private conversations, for example. One of the fastest growing industries paralleling the growth of the computer industry is security, the security of files in computers, because people very readily can infiltrate computers. We had a hilarious but serious problem 2 years ago. We have a school in New York, a private school, high school called Dalton, and some 16-year-old high school students who knew something about computer terminals were fiddling around and playing with a computer terminal and knowingly infiltrated a Toronto, I think it was Toronto, it was a Canadian bank. And they wiped out and transferred $20 million from the bank to a Swiss bank account. High school students. And these were not criminals, this was not deliberate, but they were having fun. And another example, something very close to me. I'm completing a book right now on the history of the Dow Jones Wall Street Journal, and which is a very powerful, influential company that has yards and miles of very important information stored and hopefully protected in their headquarters in New York City. And I asked one of the vice presidents, you know, if someone could infiltrate and come in and alter this information by adding or withdrawing, it would affect the whole economy of the nation and certainly would affect the destiny of many corporations and individuals. And the vice president, who took a traditional, popular point of view, said, oh no, people can't do that. I mean, we have locks on our doors and people can't infiltrate. And then I was explaining to him that all the computer hookups that they have at the Dow Jones headquarters are fed through telephone wires. And these telephone wires come from external of the building into the building. And a criminal doesn't even have to enter the building. All he has to do is find where the wire is, which is not very difficult, feeding into the building, and tap it. And if he taps it, then with the right kind of ingenuity and technology, which is not very sophisticated, he can press a few buttons and alter a decimal point. And you know what that would do to a stock market listing, altering a decimal point, adding a zero, deleting a company, making a company look good, feeding information to a news service that goes out across the world, slanderizing someone, and if the editor doesn't pick it up, it goes out as being... So, you know, what are you doing to protect yourself against this kind of infiltration? And he said, never thought about it. I said, well, you better think about it because it's going on every day. And those criminal elements in our society are very smart. And when they want something, they'll learn how to get it and they'll go after it. And they'll learn the technology to tap and to intrude. So, you know, it's not just, what I'm saying, the traditional concerns. Should they get a warrant? Should they knock on the door? And the technology is so sophisticated that a lot of these approaches that we used in the past aren't even needed. There are other ways to invade privacy.
Then you're agreeing with Nicholas Johnson, who's our next guest, when he indicated to me that even the sophisticated individuals in this subject matter don't seem too concerned, especially the average citizen does not, concerning what is happening.
Right. It's a shame because, you know, we're concerned about the price of gas, we're concerned about mortgage rates, we're concerned about cost of ham and bacon, et cetera, et cetera. How am I going to pay my way through college, Mr. Cook, and how am I going to support myself, where am I going to live? And we don't think about such important, critical issues of privacy. I think critical, and we ought to. We ought to, because once you lose your right to privacy, and it is a right, an implied right, once you've lost it, then you can't cry over spilled milk and say, I want it back. It's gone forever.
Richard Snyder.
Recently, President Reagan has signed into law tighter controls on governmental security. More items can be marked confidential, secret, top secret, and whatever else there is. And it seems to me from what you're saying, as our government learns more and more about us and stores more and more information about us, that same government, in effect, is restricting more and more what it's willing to tell us. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people, the ideal, and yet this doesn't seem to jibe with the process that's going on. Usually I hear something like, well, it's in the best interest of the country, national security, and every once in a while some newspaper man finds some ridiculous thing that's classified because of national security. Where's this process going? Where do you see it going? Is it a trend, or is this just a little bump in the...
Well, you know, first of all, the label national security has always confused and frustrated me, because as soon as you hear it's for national security, all of a sudden you back off. Well, who's defining what's for national security, and is indeed national security? Where is the trend going? You know, most of the misuse of information is done by overzealous, we're talking about government, bureaucrats. They're following what they're told to do, and they do it as eager beavers and try to carry out to the letter of the law. Part of the problem is, indeed, because we have the means, the technology, we collect and we collect. When does the person get a chance to see what's collected on him? If you don't know, where do you refute based on circumstance? Error. And things are said about us that were a joke, you know, or should when we were 12 and we broke the our next door neighbor's window with a baseball, you know, when we were young, before computers, it was all forgotten, right? Got a spanking, that was the end. But now it might get recorded, or if you were arrested and convicted, you know, but in the past it was forgotten with time. Now it's not forgotten, and it's stored and stored. And I would like to see us move in the direction, you know, Mrs. Snyder, based on your question, where the kind of information that we collect would be directly related as a function of our level of responsibility in society. For example, the person who sweeps the floor in this building, what is his impact on society or on other people's lives? I'm not denigrating his position. I would guess that his impact on other people's lives at the school is not very great. The person who flies me from Spokane back to New York City on a 747, and there are 250 passengers, his impact on 250 people is very great. Therefore, we should know much more about him and his private world as well as his overt activities. And so we should start collecting. And whether it's done by a private sector or by the government is not for me to say. But, you know, we have to reconcile that. The problem with what I'm just saying is you take to the ultimate, how much information should we be collecting about, for example, the President of the United States, who has an impact over 220 million or perhaps the whole world, and does he not indeed have the right to privacy? You know, how much do we have to know about people is really what I'm saying. And I think we're just, because in part of the technology, we're hungry for information. We're peeping Toms. A lot of things, we all have skeletons in our closet, and we shouldn't be forced to tell many things, and we shouldn't be asked to give information. There are ironies involved. You know, Social Security, when it started in 1935, when numbers were given, it was kind of an ingenious thing. Well, it was during the Depression, and there was a man in Minnesota who was trying to make a few dollars to survive, so he had an idea to manufacture a wallet with a little window, and in the window he put a fake Social Security card with a series of numbers. That following year, 16,000 people on their income tax used that Social Security number that was in the manufactured wallet, thinking it was their Social Security number. And so, you know, numbers can trap us in many different ways. And I say, you know, people have to be much more sensitive to what's being collected and how information is used on them. Lou Reed.
Dr. Rosenberg, you're considered a futurist, which I'm never quite sure what that really means.
Neither do I.
Do you have a crystal ball or something? What do you think is going to be the impact of the burgeoning use of individual computers? Everyone is supposedly in 20 years going to have their own individual computer and perhaps living at home and working at home. Do you see this, what kinds of impact, and specifically on the question of information and privacy?
That's an interesting issue. I don't think too many people have thought about it, including myself. If individual computers, which are proliferating and will increase in numbers, if people use them, as I understand they're attempting to help them with school, to help them with financial matters, and they will be storing in these machines, for example, in preparation for today, income tax day, they will store on their machines and then at the appropriate time press the button and all their tax information will be poured out. Okay, so what we're doing is centralizing. And as you centralize, you make that information potentially interesting to somebody else. And then someone, a celebrity or a powerful corporate leader or some other individual politician or a movie star has done this, and there it is stored in his little house computer in his den. Someone breaks into his house or infiltrates the wire that feeds into it, presses the button, he said, gee, I didn't have to go out and bribe someone or steal it. It's all, he just conveniently gave it to me in his own little home computer. And then, I'm sort of fantasizing with you. I could see that as a potential problem.
I was just thinking that to some degree it's like writing a diary.
That's right.
And
that's very
good.
Right.
That you are actually exposing yourself, even though there may be a lot of conveniences that accrue from having your own personal computer. It also is saying I'm willing to expose myself.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most private things for all American citizens is our income tax. You know, if we knew that IRS was sharing it with the public or other agencies of the government, as serious the problem is today about people telling the truth in their income taxes, they certainly would be less truthful.
I must interrupt. I'm sorry we're out of time. Dr. Rosenberg, I have to say this has been one of our most informative programs in 10 years. I thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Pleased to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Jerry Rosenberg, the chairman of the Department of Business Administration at Rutgers University. It has been a very exciting issue. I want to invite you to be with us again next week when Nicholas Johnson will continue this overall question. I hope you have a nice week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.